Would you eat an apple every day?
So an apple's got about the same sugar content as Coca-Cola. And people say, oh, one's natural sugar and the other one's not natural sugar. Well, no, they're both 10% sugar, both fructose and glucose. Guess what fructose does in the liver?
Dr. Gary Fettke is a world-leading orthopedic surgeon who's on a mission to fight chronic disease, avoid surgery, and save your life.
And it comes down to what you eat every day.
There is not a single biochemical pathway which requires ingested carbohydrate. I say it over and over again. We do not need a carbohydrate in our diet. Everywhere where the blood glucose is elevated, you're toasting your tissue. So you're toasting your kidneys, you're toasting your brain, you're toasting your eyes, every single corner of the body. And that's just one aspect of the glucose metabolism. The crunch time for me was when I had a guy in his 40s that I was considering amputating both of his lower limbs. I ended up amputating one of them. And he was sitting there in hospital eating ice cream. The pathology within his limb didn't happen on that last week. It had built up over decades. If you have more than 4 grams of carbohydrate at one hit, it's going to affect the lining of every blood vessel. It damages that. If it goes above 4 grams, you'll produce insulin. Insulin also is an inflammatory hormone. It's also a growth hormone which stimulates cancer. We're not talking about very much. And this might seem somewhat extreme. I'm talking about a bite of an apple.
Another question that people ask is, well, what do I eat? Everything seems bad.
Okay, I'll summarise it in one sentence. I often say, if you want to eat by the food pyramid, you're going to die by the food pyramid. We've screwed ourselves over.
If you think you're eating healthy, you might be surprised by what you hear from my guest today, Dr. Gary Fettke. There are some foods that I bet you're eating every single day, which is slowly causing disease. Now, this information is not what you're going to hear from the mainstream. You won't hear this from big food or big pharma, but it's advice that could potentially save your life. So if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button, because 81% of you that watch these episodes regularly have not subscribed. And by the simple act of subscribing, you can help share this message to millions more people that need to hear it. And now for the episode with Dr. Gary Fettke. Dr. Fettke, welcome.
Good morning or good afternoon, evening, wherever you are.
Now, you are an orthopedic surgeon for the last 30 years, and you've seen so many patients at the end stage of their chronic disease who need their legs or their arms amputated or cut off. And over 90% of the reason for this is because of the foods that we are eating. And the most shocking thing is that some of these foods are actually marketed to us as healthy. And Dr. Fettke, when you told us the truth about why this was happening, you were silenced until now. So today, Dr. Fettke is going to talk about the 3 main causes of chronic inflammation, what's causing chronic disease, but most importantly, these harmful, dangerous foods that we need to avoid. So Dr. Fettke, my first question. Back in 2016, you were silenced. Why?
Why? At the time, I didn't know. I thought it was a joke. I was actually talking about preventative health, particularly in the management of diabetes complications. And the crunch time for me was when I had a guy in his 40s that I was considering amputating both of his lower limbs. I ended up amputating one of them, and he's in hospital and trying to control literally out of control infection in both of his feet and legs. And he was sitting there in hospital eating ice cream. He's got out of control sugars, out of control infection. I said, why are you eating ice cream? He said, they told me I can have it. And I said, I said all sorts of things at the time, but I then started looking at the hospital food guidelines, which said it's okay if you've got type 2 diabetes and it's out of control, that you can still be given ice cream 3 times a day with morning and afternoon tea and supper snacks, including biscuits, cakes, cookies. A totally ridiculous diet with no nutritional benefit, yet that was actually the national food guidelines, and it still is. And I've presented the national food bodies about that, and they say, no, it's not. And I say, look, here is your document. So as it turned out, I started challenging the hospital food, going, this is ridiculous. But I then started studying nutrition, which is something we're not taught in medicine. And so I started studying, in particular, the role of sugar. And at that time, it was primarily fructose, but as it's turned out, that's evolved into a bigger topic, which we can get to. But effectively, I challenged the hospital food system, and particularly the sugar content. I then went on this thing called social media, and within 48 hours was targeted by someone who was working for Coca-Cola at the time. And over time, I was then targeted by people who was working for I was targeted by the breakfast cereal industry, and we've got all this documentation to prove that. Then I was reported to the medical board for inappropriately giving nutritional advice outside of my scope of practice, even though we're talking about preventative health. I'm advising my patients, stop eating sugar, particularly if you've got diabetes, and stop eating ultra-processed food, particularly if you've got inflammation. And so I got reported to the medical board, and by a dietitian at the hospital, and we take the trail back. We've got the emails and the receipts from the food industry, the breakfast cereal industry, to the Dietitians Association here in Australia, the CEO of the hospital, of the Dietitians Association, demanding that the CEO of my hospital silence me. And then we've got the email trail to the dietitians saying, and then it's just ridiculous. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But I honestly thought when I got reported to the medical board for advising my patients with out of control diabetes not to have sugar, that was a joke. And I wrote back to them pretty well saying, that's a joke. But they took it seriously. As it turned out, I got reported another 2 times over the next 2 years, one of which was for inappropriately reversing someone's type 2 diabetes on national TV. So it was inappropriate to put someone's type 2 diabetes into remission. So I was targeted behaviour. And then, and we'll come back to that later, but the expert witness who the medical board brought in to give a judgment was a very, very high-profile nutritional expert from the world who was actually working for the breakfast cereal industry. So I was getting targeted. The medical board were being compromised. I couldn't believe it. But, what behind me, what used to be a table tennis table in this room became the war zone. The war room where we literally had a table tennis table in paperwork, defending it. In the process of that, defending myself, I've pretty well done a PhD on nutrition and the actual biochemistry of science, and my wife's done pretty well a PhD in the vested interests behind it. So ultimately, I was exonerated on all charges and actually received an apology in writing, not a public one, and we were able to get them to retract the media statements they'd made about me, which is, again, this is all political. It had nothing to do about patient care. It had nothing to do about biochemistry. It had nothing to do about science. And that's the tragedy that we've all been growing up in, evolved in the information we're receiving. It's actually not science. It's politics. It's money. It's ideology. It's fascinating how much we've been screwed over.
Well, that's where I wanted to lead this conversation in terms of the foods that are kind of screwing us over and where that's kind of coming from. I wanted to focus on your patient that you mentioned earlier, because you see the worst kinds of patients in your career as an orthopedic surgeon. 40 years old, he was needing to lose 2 legs, but he actually lost 1 leg. You amputated 1 leg. I know that's hard for people to hear. Sounds a bit full on. Why did that happen?
Why? I mean, the pathology within his limb didn't happen on that last week. It had built up over decades. And when you start realizing that this is a slow, insidious torture of your body, and the processed food that we've had, well, arguably since the agricultural revolution. So you can trace our inflammatory joint disease, we can trace back modern disease back to the agricultural revolution. You can go to pre-agricultural revolution skeletons, and in Spain, they will identify, that's pre-agricultural revolution, that's post-agricultural revolution, literally in the changes in their bone, which I think is fascinating. So we've had a change for the last 10,000, arguably somewhere about 10,000 years. Could be 15,000 because there's some theories about that. But 10,000 years we've been processing carbohydrates into our diet, milling grains, storing grains. Arguably our culture is actually related to that. But in the last 40 or 50 years, we have exponentially increased our inflammatory component to disease. And I think that's really the ultra-processed foods, and then we can discuss what I think is the major components of that. Ultra-processed foods now have been giving us low-grade inflammation right through the body. So in the person with diabetes, we can talk a bit about fructose metabolism, glucose metabolism, inflammatory seed oils in that process, but he has had a slow, chronic inflammation in every blood vessel, in every cell, in every mitochondrial membrane for as long as he's been eating processed food. And the culmination of that over time is that you end up with microvascular disease, narrowing of every blood vessel. You've got chronic inflammation in the tissues, a fibrosis in the tissues. So they have poor circulation, poor local immunity, and all you need is a little tiny scratch or break in the skin, dry skin, some bacteria get in there, fungal infections get in there, and then the body doesn't have the ability to fight that. And so over a long, long period of time, the body can't. It sets up, and it's a war between the local infection and the body's immune system trying to control it. And the longer you go down the path of poor diabetes control, the more the infection is going to win. And the only way to get rid of that isn't with dressings and antibiotics. It's to chop the bit of dead tissue off, because no good circulation is going to get in. So you've got to get back to an area where there's reasonable circulation. And I'm saying not good circulation, because if you ever came along to one of my clinics, it used to be called Fettke's effed up fructose-free fungating foot folly Fridays. And behind me is a golden toilet brush. I have that there. My registrars gave it to me because they recognised that amongst all of my colleagues, I got to clean all that up. So therefore, all the horrible deep infections, it's not just diabetic foot problems. I did probably most of the deep joint infections. So someone has a hip replacement or a knee replacement. Same problem in our society now, poor immunity, deep infections in joint replacements, months in hospital. Same problem. If you've got a person who's chronically inflamed and they've got diabetes, they're in deep strife. They're not going to fight that. So what can we do about it? That's the very first thing is, do we keep chopping limbs off? Because 30 years ago, I would see the rare person who had a diabetic toe problem. To the end of my surgical career in the public system was every week there'd be 20 to 30 patients in that clinic with gangrenous toes, gangrenous feet, and you'd be doing this slow but sure. Chop a bit of the toe off, chop another toe off, then chop off the forefoot, then the midfoot, then the ankle, and then the below knee amputation. And if you end up with a below knee amputation, your mortality, your 2-year mortality is around 50%. So 50% of people die within 2 years of having leg amputation.
Just from having processed foods and sugar?
Yes.
I think that so many people, when they think about sugar and processed foods, even like healthy sugars, which we're going to talk about.
Sorry, there must have been some static on the line. I thought you said healthy sugars. Because I don't think there are any.
Well, that's the thing, because I think a lot of people are having these so-called healthy sugars every day because, as I said at the start, it's marketed to them, but they don't know the downward effects. One of them is amputation of the limbs, which is, a very extreme effect of what could happen. But I also wanted to ask about the effects of sugar, all types of sugar, on the brain. How does it affect the brain?
Well, can I come? I'm going to go to a little bit of biochemistry and cooking at the same time, because I think this is a cornerstone which everyone can understand. And it's called the Maillard reaction. So anybody who's gone cooking, if you go past a bakery, you'll see all those breads and pastries and cookies and whatever, which are all brown. They've all tanned. That brown is actually called cooking terms, the Maillard reaction, MAILLARD. So look it up. And what it is, it's a caramelization. And what happens actually under the effect of heat, you get a combination of the glucose, which is half of sugar. It's glucose combining with the protein, and it browns it, caramelizes. Now, if you've got diabetes and your blood glucose goes up, some of that glucose goes into the tissues, about 2/3 of it. So if you elevated blood glucose, and I think glucose is a terrible thing, and the body does everything in its capacity to get rid of it. So, which is a different sort of slant on it. Anyway, the blood glucose goes up, the tissue glucose goes up, and under the effect of body heat, there is a glycation of protein. So the glucose combines with the protein, and under that small amount of body heat, it combines and caramelizes. So it's literally toasting your tissue. So everywhere where the blood glucose is elevated, you're toasting your tissue. So you're toasting your kidneys, you're toasting your brain, you're toasting your eyes, you're toasting your toes, every single corner of the body. And that's just one aspect of the glucose metabolism. So therefore, how does that fit into the brain? Well, every time your blood glucose goes up, that's going into your brain and you're slowly toasting your brain. And so type 3 diabetes is sometimes called dementia. And dementia and Alzheimer's are all loosely connected, but one of the major components of it isn't just, it's not just glucose, it's not just diabetes, but it's a major player. And so as we move forward in life, what you want to do is you want to knock down the major components creating inflammation in the body. And one of the major components is ultra-processed food. And you're going to reduce your risk of dementia. You're going to reduce your risk of brain damage, but you will reduce it in yourself. There may be some improvement and recovery. But one of the arguments I use is you're going to improve the health of your children because you're setting the example. And whoever the elders are in the family, they're generally saying, okay, this is what the family's going to eat. And a lot of people say, oh, my health problems are generational and it's genetics. And I say, no, that's nonsense because it's the way you're eating what your parents ate and what your grandparents ate. And so for the last couple of generations, we've been having this massive exposure to ultra-processed food. And so what does it do to the brain? It's actually you can improve your own situation. And there's some work, particularly by Stephen Kinane, who's actually looked at turning dementia around neurodegenerative disorders, having a significant improvement particularly in functional capacity by going onto a ketogenic diet. So we know that here's the problem. This is what the causation is, but it's actually not just complaining about it. Here's actually a solution. And it all comes back to what we eat or don't eat.
So every time that somebody eats something that is sugary and carbohydrates, it all breaks down into sugar. Every time your blood sugar is elevated, that is toasting all of your cells, your eyes, your brain, your heart, causing disease over 20 or 30 years, which may require the patient to come see you and get their leg amputated. Is that a bit extreme to say?
No, I don't think so. Because it's, if you go along and have one piece of bread, I'm not saying you're going to get dementia. But if you have one slice of bread has 5 teaspoons of glucose in it. I think that above 1 teaspoon of glucose, that has a negative effect on the system. It actually has a detrimental effect. So we can call that toxicity. If all of the science behind that, that was my COVID talk, which is on YouTube, carbohydrate, the dose is the poison. Because if we're demonizing carbs, I went through the academic argument trying to work out actually what is the dose. Because the dose is the poison, that's an age-old adage. So the dose, I came up with the argument that 4 grams of glucose, above 4 grams of glucose, above 1 teaspoon of glucose, above 1/5 of a slice of bread, starts to have a negative effect on the system. One of those effects is that when the blood glucose goes up, the tissue glucose goes up and you get the myode reaction. But there's other effects that it does the same thing when we give ourselves a glucose load. So one slice of bread is not going to give you dementia, but one spike of your blood glucose every day for the rest of your life might.
And so for people that are thinking 1 teaspoon or 4 grams of glucose, what does that look like in terms of how much, what food, exactly? Like just one example.
So it's literally 1 teaspoon of sugar, 1 teaspoon of glucose. That is that's it, 4 grams. So 4 grams is a small amount. It's about 1/5 of a slice of bread. A standard bowl of pasta, it's 1/20 of a standard bowl of pasta. We're not talking about very much. I'm talking about, and this might seem somewhat extreme, I'm talking about a bite of an apple. So an apple's got about the same sugar content as Coca-Cola. And people say, oh, one's natural sugar and the other one's not natural sugar. No, they're both 10% sugar, both fructose and glucose. They're both 10% sugar. And over a long period of time, that's sugar. Doesn't matter which one it is. A banana's got more sugar in it than Coca-Cola. That's 16 to 24%, depending on how ripe it is.
As Dr. Fettke mentions, one of the biggest causes of chronic disease is sugar, specifically those things that we think contain healthy sugar. But I do want to point out that what we eat is just one part of overall health. Another very important aspect, which not many people talk about, is mental health. And what I mean by that is the thoughts that you're thinking every single day and your emotional well-being. And in fact, loneliness and social isolation has been proven to affect your cell's mitochondria. And that's why I have BetterHelp as a sponsor of today's video. BetterHelp will connect you to a licensed therapist who is trained to listen to you and give you unbiased advice. And there have been times in my life that I needed extra support. And more recently, it was from my dad's diagnosis of a terminal brain disease. And I found this particularly beneficial because sometimes you can't speak to your family or friends, maybe out of judgment, or maybe they might not understand. And the best thing about BetterHelp is that you can do it all from your phone or computer via video call, phone call, or messaging. It is the easiest way to connect yourself to a therapist, and they'll match you to a professional that has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. So if you'd like more support, just head to betterhelp.com/primal podcast or choose Primal Podcast on the sign up page and get a special discount on your first month. I just had a question about carbohydrates again, because I think people are very confused about carbohydrates, because on one hand, you'll hear somebody like you, Dr. Chafee, Dr. Kemberi, saying zero carbohydrate or even very low carbohydrate. But then you also have a lot of proponents saying that a small amount of carbohydrates, like say 100 grams of carbohydrates, is okay. And I think there's going to be a lot of confusion amongst people just thinking, well, can I have carbohydrates? How much is too much? Can you answer that question?
I think, again, if we're looking at it purely from a biochemical aspect, if you have more than 4 grams of carbohydrate at one hit, it's going to affect the blood lining of the lining of every blood vessel, which is called the glycocalyx. It damages that, but it repairs itself. It will, if it spikes above normal levels, it will go into the tissues and it will create the Maillard reaction. If it goes above 4 grams, you'll produce insulin. A small amount of insulin will turn that glucose, that carbohydrate, into fat. That's fine, but over a long period of time, pushing that excess carbohydrate into fat makes us fatter. Insulin also is an inflammatory hormone. It's also a growth hormone which stimulates cancer. So a low-grade chronic inflammatory dose of insulin over a long period of time is a growth hormone for cancer. That's why people with diabetes have got higher rates of cancer. It's part of the insulin-resistant state. So a small, 100 grams of glucose, fine. But don't do it all the time, because your body over a long period of time is actually not meant to have that. Our bodies are meant to actually eat sugar in season to get fat for winter hibernation. And at that time, when we eat sugar in season to get fat for winter hibernation, it drives behavior towards eating more and storage of fat. And then we burn that off in our hibernation fasting period. That's what happens in the animal kingdom. You never see dietary guidelines for chimpanzees and birds and ducks, do you? Right? They seem to manage without intervention of humans and corporates. And fruit I find fascinating because the benefits of fruit are clearly overstated, both by the corporate world and by nature. So there's a talk of mine, is fruit good or bad for you, which stemmed out of a debate with a professor of nutrition. And I wasn't meant to be a debate, and it turned into a debate. And so again, just down to the biochemistry. So fruit, if you're an animal, fruit will drive behavior. So you'll see the fruit, which is advertised in nature by being bright and shiny and sweet. It will then drive you to eat it because A, you're attracted to it. You'll go and find it. You'll eat it. Animals will do this in the wild all the time. They'll eat it one day before you want to eat it as a human because they'll just wait for the sugar level to go up. They will gorge themselves on it. It will turn into fat for that winter hibernation, and they'll lie around in a lethargic phase. I don't know if you've ever seen those pictures of monkeys that are actually gorging themselves on fruit, and then they're lying around in a drunken stupor for a while. Guess what fructose does in the liver? Fructose gets converted down the aldehyde pathway into alcohol. Over a long period of time, if you drink too much alcohol, you'll get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, one of the causes of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. If you eat too much sugar over a period of time, you'll get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Is it any wonder that if you have a sugar load and it gets turned into alcohol in the liver, that a few hours later you're lethargic? Think about the Christmas lunches that everyone's lying around afterwards. It's not just the alcohol, it's the food that you've had, which has actually made you go, I can't eat anymore, I'm tired, I'm lethargic, I want to have a sleep. And a part of this, I think, is actually what is related to children's motivation. We've got generations of kids who are not wanting to go out and do stuff, slothful, half-mind, brain dead, sitting in front of screens. But food is part of that. And if you actually sat down with your 5-year-old and your 7-year-old and gave them a glass of beer or wine every day, you wouldn't expect good health outcomes. Well, that's what sugar does in the liver. That's just one of the pathways of sugar, of fructose in the liver, excuse me, down the aldehyde pathway is into alcohol production. And so one of my slides has got, put fructose in and you get a glass of red wine out the side. Again, I'm simplifying complex biochemistry, but that's what it does. So the other thing that fruit does, or what fructose does, it actually stimulates ghrelin. So ghrelin's a hormone which is produced by the stomach to give you the tummy rumbling, and it makes you feel hungry. Well, fructose stimulates that. Fructose also inhibits leptin. So leptin's a hormone secreted from our fat. So if you've got plenty of fat on board, plenty of storage, the leptin is secreted and it tells your brain, stop eating. Fructose comes in when you eat it, tells you, and inhibits that pathway. So you're losing these pathways of inhibition, or you're gaining the pathway of stimulation to make you hungry, which makes sense if you're a possum or if you're a squirrel or something trying to get hold of an enormous amount of sugar and carbohydrate so you can get fat for winter. So literally you can overeat. And again, we see that in society. You put sugar on the table. You go to a Chinese restaurant, sweet and sour sauces. They've got all these spices in it. They put the sugar in them to make them more palatable, but they put the sugar in them. I'm talking about Western Chinese restaurants, but literally that food is laced with sugar so that you will eat more. And you'll turn that, so you'll eat more. You will also get a bit thirsty because sugar and carbohydrates in combination, you need more insulin to produce that insulin. Means you store more water, so you get more thirsty. So it's a perfect thing to put in food in restaurants. It's a perfect food to put in food by the processed food industry because it will drive behaviour for you to eat more. I mean, it's like if you open up a packet of chocolate biscuits, it's really hard to eat one. In nature, it's really hard to eat one cherry. If I give you a bowl of cherries, well, it's not nature, but you put a bowl of cherries there, who can eat one? They eat one. Oh, they're bright, shiny, red, attracting my attention. A second one can't possibly hurt. Oh, and all of a sudden you've eaten a bowl of cherries. And that's our natural primitive reflex. We're just animals. And we are meant to actually succumb to that behaviour. So it's a really hard thing to overcome in nature when it's in abundance, because we're completely wired to drive ourselves insane and eat as much as we can.
You spoke about the damage that fructose does to the body, but people might be thinking, okay, you mentioned a few foods there, but how do I know that I'm eating fructose every day? Because I think that most people still are, but it's hidden. The first thing I want to talk about is fruit. Now, you alluded to fruit earlier, but I want to ask you a question about apples. Would you eat an apple every day?
Would I eat an apple a day? No, I think it's 10% sugar. I think the fibre content of fruit is overrated because you don't actually need fibre in your diet. That's another controversial comment. But fibre in our diet is not the primary benefit of a good diet. I think we have a good gut microbiome from a variety of foods in our gut, and it's not dependent on the fibre. We're told that it is because that's a marketing term by the cereal industry to actually get us to eat more fibre. The vitamin C, we actually don't, there's very little vitamin C in an apple. And in fact, if you don't eat carbohydrate, you don't actually need much vitamin C in the metabolism of it. That's another pathway of fructose. I can keep coming back to that, but fructose gets converted to uric acid in the liver. One of the breakdown products is uric acid. Uric acid is the thing which most people hear about with gout. But there's increasing gout in society, but people are having less alcohol and less red meat in society than 20, 30 years ago, but we've had a doubling of gout. And it's related to fructose. So fructose gets converted to uric acid. Uric acid can push up your blood pressure, but it does that by a pathway called related to nitric oxide. So nitric oxide, and I know some of you guests have been talking about that in the past, but nitric oxide has a major, major benefit. In fact, without nitric oxide, we're dead. Nitric oxide keeps our blood vessels open. It keeps our blood flow going to our brains, and it's central part in the immune system and how white cells move around into the tissues with infection or with just controlling dead tissue. So we need nitric oxide. Nitric oxide production is inhibited by uric acid. So uric acid is, we eat the fructose, the liver converts the fructose into uric acid. The uric acid inhibits nitric oxide production. The antidote for that is vitamin C. So Mother Nature, in her wisdom, has, if we're going to eat fruit in season and we're going to gorge ourselves on it for that short period of time, then the fructose is going to get converted into uric acid, but she's going to provide a little bit of an antidote in vitamin C at the same time. Brilliant. And that's fine. Do that over a long, long period of time of eating too much sugar. And fruit gets demonized, but fruit will make you hungry. Do that over a long period of time, and then it's a waxing and waning: uric acid, nitric oxide, fructose, alcohol production, inflammation. It's all waxing and waning. But the fascinating thing, but if you don't eat the carbohydrate, you don't actually have that converted into fructose. You don't need the vitamin C. So the Arctic explorers in history, the Inuit Eskimos, the early explorers that came around the world, did not need vitamin C. It was the European sailors that were having their grains and their gruel and then got scurvy that needed the antidote of limes and citrus fruits to give, so they could explore greater nations. But it's really, so I actually think that the early European explorers, they struggled because of scurvy. But if they had have just been eating meat and fish on the boats, they might not have had the scurvy, because the more northern European explorers didn't have the scurvy, because you don't end up with a vitamin C deficiency if you don't need the vitamin C. Carbohydrate ingestion, and particularly fruit ingestion, you need vitamin C as an antidote to the poisons that it's actually creating inside the body. There. So do I eat an apple a day? No.
Well, I just wanted to ask that question because doctors say, eat an apple a day. It's going to improve your health. And then a lot of people just think that, I did another video with Dr. Filippo Verdi, who's a cardiac heart surgeon, and he said an apple a day is the worst thing for your health. So much controversy around that. But I do want to talk about some other fruits in case people are like, well, I don't like apples, but I like pears, cherries, mangoes, watermelon, grapes, bananas. Are they all high in fructose? They should be avoided.
Yes, and yes. But you can, yes, they've all got fructose loads. If you're going to eat some fruit, understand that it's going to drive behaviour. If you're going, that's it. So if you're going to eat fruit for breakfast, you're going to be hungry within 2 hours. Anybody who eats fruit, 2 hours later, they're still hungry. It's just what it does. If you're going to eat some fruit, if you are, then maybe eat it as a little thing before you go to bed, knowing that you're hungry whilst you're asleep and your metabolism sorting it out and storing it as fat overnight. You didn't mention berries in that list there. One of the things that people talk about berries is all the benefits of antioxidants, and you can have frozen berries, and what's interesting, after 2 to 3 months of freezing your berries, those micronutrients, the phytonutrients, the antioxidant behaviour of them is completely gone. So if people have frozen berries in their freezer thinking, I'll have that out of season, then they're just little pebbles of sugar. So don't kid yourself, because again, that's marketing, but they don't tell you that if you freeze this product, it's going to lose its benefit. You mentioned mangoes. I think mangoes are interesting because mangoes, or if you look, I think all fruit, modern fruit, has been bastardized. It's been modified, and doesn't have to be genetically modified, over time to be bigger, sweeter, lower fibre amounts, because fibre will make something rot and go rotten a lot quicker. Sugar, the increase in the sugar and content of it improves the shelf life. And we can look at that from a cake aspect. A piece of bread got some fibre in it, and it will go mouldy in a certain time frame. If you put more sugar in that bread, it will last longer. And if you put more sugar and make it into cake, it will last longer. And so the classic is a fruit cake, or in your wedding day, you'll have a fruit cake with lots of icing on it. And you can come back and eat that in 20 years' time because the icing and the fruit has literally been a preservative. So by adding the sugar and decreasing the fibre, you've improved the shelf life and the transportability and the profitability of fruit. So our modern day fruit, our mangoes are now twice the size they used to be. They've increased the sugar content by 50% in comparison with 20 years ago. They've decreased the fibre content by 20 or 30%. And then you take the soil, which is actually nutritionally depleted now. So our fruit of 2024 has less micronutrients in it than our fruit of 100 years ago. It's got more chemicals in it. Our fertilizing ability means that we bind the magnesium in it. You put potassium into the fertilizer, it binds the magnesium in the soil. So virtually all of our food, not just fruit, is actually magnesium depleted now. So even your animal-based product has a reduced magnesium in comparison with 50 to 100 years ago. So we've screwed ourselves over, and their marketing of such is that, as I say, fruit is bright, shiny, and palatable to us and drives behavior for us to eat it.
I do want to ask you, moving on from fruit, about honey. What's your thoughts about honey?
Honey, again, I talk about honey in nature is difficult to find, and if you do want to do it, get hold of it. You've got to raid a beehive. The honey is being stored by the bees for their winter hibernation. So if you want to rape and pillage someone's house of all their worldly goods, understand you're doing that to a beehive. Honey is high. It's about 55% fructose, 45% glucose, whereas sugar is 50% fructose, 50% glucose on the whole. Those percentages may change a little bit, but it's got a slightly higher fructose content, so it is a bit sweeter. And because it's a bit sweeter, it drives behaviour. Ancient Egyptians, you can still get, they've opened up some of those tombs to actually find honey that's still there, again, because it's preserved for hundreds and hundreds of years because of its sugar content. Again, honey in small amounts, fine, but understand that honey in your glass jar in your pantry is not natural. It has come through a method of production which has been around for hundreds of years, not thousands of years, but only a few hundred years. And the other side is that we need bees to be pollinating our trees and our fruits and our grains and our lands and our grasses so our animals can eat it. And we've interfered in their ecology so much that this is the environmental aspect of our food production. We've actually got, in the US, they have bee colonies which they transport from the east to the west coast and vice versa, with a massive loss of beehives just to pollinate the fruit trees and the crops. Our pesticides are clearly playing a role in bee populations, and our future is looking pretty bleak if our bee populations reduce. Here's a slight tangent, exactly the same topic. I know you told me to stay on topic, but I had a patient who was a beekeeper, and he'd move his beehives around. And in Tasmania, there's a thing called leatherwood honey, and it's known for its medicinal benefit and all sorts of stuff. But he used to say that when beehives were put into fields of canola, the bees went crazy. So he'd put them in the bush, put them in the wild, put them anywhere. But the moment because we've got some canola, fields around here as well. So that industrial seed oil, canola oil that the bees were feeding on, the nectar on them, was driving the bees crazy. All the swarms just went angry. And so every time you put them into a canola area and the canola was flowering, the bees would go stir crazy, and he'd have to take them out, put them back in the bush. They'd calm right down again. Pure anecdote, but that's from a beekeeper who didn't know anything about fructose metabolism nor about polyunsaturated oil effect. Anyway, side issue. Honey, I used to be addicted to all this stuff. I'd have my fruit for breakfast, fruit for snacks. I'd have honey cornflakes, honey toasted cornflakes, and I used to have honey, just a spoonful of it. I was completely addicted. I'm sorry, I was wrong. I was wrong to myself. It's not needed. It was driving behavior. It was making me hungry, and it was contributing to my weight and health issues. So that's a long answer to no, I don't need it.
Well, I just wanted to outline that because I think that some people still might have even half a teaspoon of honey or in their tea or their coffee. They might have a piece of fruit. It's very, very common, but we have to think that if we have this every single day for 20 or 30 years, what's going to happen is that you could be like the patient that you had at 40, losing a limb. It's extreme, but it's something that we have to understand in our brains. I also want to mention other foods high in fructose so people can understand: agave syrup, of course, fruit juices, barbecue sauce, and ketchup. So sauces also have fructose.
Up to 40% sugar. Again, it comes to reading the label. You say, but the trouble is the industry doesn't have to call it sugar. There's over 100 different names, and you've just, mentioned agave syrup, and if it's got agave syrup or it's got honey or it's different. And they're just the names of the natural sugar. And so, I can't recite 100 of them off the top of my head, but you can. It's literally just marketing to confuse us. When I can look at it and go, oh, that's a sugar, that's a sugar, that's a sugar, that's a sugar. And they may list 5 different sugars on there by different names, but they don't have to sort of group them together as sugar. You can get a guess, though, however, if you read the percentages. In Australia, we're actually better at having our labellings better than in the US, because it will tell you the percentage of carbohydrate and it'll tell you the percentage of sugars. When in the US, it doesn't have to do that. It'll mention what the ingredients are, but not the percentages. So we're a little bit better off, but most people don't read labels. And one of the huge issues is that 40% of the population here in Tasmania, and I don't think it's any different in the Western world, are now functionally illiterate. So I think the inability to read a label is dramatic. So companies can write all sorts of stuff on the label, but unless you can read the label, you're illiterate. Belinda and I presented to a Senate inquiry here in Australia a couple of years ago, and it's changed the food labelling law based on that one concept. So the alternate meat industry, the fake food industry, would have a picture of a chicken or a picture of a cow or a picture of a pig on it and call it, plant-based chicken, plant-based meat, or plant-based beef, plant-based sausage. But they had a picture of a chicken, a cow, a pig on it. And what the evidence I presented was 41% of the Tasmanian population and arguably the rest of Australia are functionally illiterate. So they can't read plant-based chicken. All they can see is a picture of a chicken on there. So the food labelling here in Australia, as a result of that presentation, has changed. It's now illegal for the food industry to put a picture of a chicken on a plant-based chicken product. They can write plant-based chicken, they cannot have a picture of it. So that functional literacy is really important because 40% of people can't read the food label. And probably there's a percentage of the others who can read the food label who won't understand it. So the food industry get around it. So, we've put it on the label. Well, functionally 50% of people aren't actually going to be able to work out what's actually written on the label. Really important thing going forward.
Or they won't understand the words that are, if they can read it, functionally read it, they won't understand the words that are on the label either.
Well, there are 2 ways to look at that. One is, I'll argue, if it's got a label on it telling you what's in it, don't eat it. Number one. Number 2, if it's got 5 things on it, definitely don't eat it. If it's got more than 5, stay away from it completely. And it's tragic, but we live in a processed food industry and a processed food society. We're very privileged. I'm very privileged. I live in Tasmania. I'm surrounded by wonderful land, agricultural product, clean health, clean environment, and access to good food. I'm very privileged. There are significant places in the world which are food deserts. Central areas, Chicago, Shanghai, New York. It's really hard to get unprocessed good food. So if you're privileged enough to actually, I talk about this, if you're privileged enough to actually have access to this good food, then it's an insult to the rest of society who don't have the privilege to get hold of it to actually not eat it. So I'm fortunate, but I'm functionally literate, I think. People might think I've lost the plot, but I can actually read a food label if I want to. But our houses, we have and this comes from Karen Zinn, who's a dietitian in New Zealand. We have an empty pantry, full fridge, but that means shopping regularly. It means actually having to prepare food. And the expensive way, people say, it's expensive to be low carb, keto, carnivore, and eating all that fresh food. I say, no, because we've done the costing of that. So processed food, and we've actually done all this in food plans and whatever. If you're eating fresh, local, seasonal, whole food in season, it's cheaper, it's readily available. But what it is expensive in is that it's expensive in your time to prepare that. So to eat healthy requires more time. But then that's what the joy of eating is. It's the joy of, that's what families should do. They should prepare the food together, communicate together, eat together. That's a wonderful societal thing that we should be doing. And I say to my patients, you've got a choice. You can spend the time preparing your food now and spending quality family time. Or you can spend that time in my waiting room waiting for me. You can spend the rest of that same amount of time down the path in hospitals and in sickness. Or you can spend that time cooking and having family time now. I mean, again, this is philosophy, but it's actually what we should be doing. And we've a whole lot of societies and modern building designs don't have kitchens in them. They've got microwaves. We've got societies built up around processed food and a delivery of processed food and Uber Eats, and sorry about branding that, but I mean, that's food delivered to your doorstep on a motorbike. It drives me insane because it's blatantly obvious what's going on in front of us. If you just step back and go, we've got a health disaster. I know I'm off track, but I often say, if you want to eat by the food pyramid, you're going to die by the food pyramid. And along the way, you're going to look like the food pyramid. That shape, we're triangular, and, you walk down the street. It's no different in it. Most people's backyards, go down the street, everyone looks like a food pyramid. And, my social experiment is I look at people's shopping trolleys and judge what they're going to look like before I look at them. And most times I'm right. And I'm not being harsh. I'm practicing a clinical thinker. So, okay, if you're going to eat that food, or food, in inverted commas, well, most people pay more attention to what fuel they put in their cars than what they put in their bodies. And if we just paid the same amount of attention to that, and we spend a bit of time and effort, we're all going to be infinitely healthier.
Absolutely. I want to move on to the next cause of what's making us sick and inflamed. So we spoke about fructose. We spoke about the foods that are kind of high in fructose that we need to avoid. So the fruit, the honey, agave syrup, fruit juices, barbecue sauce, ketchup, anything with a label, you read it, there's some sugar in it, avoid it. So fructose is deadly. The next one is glucose. And I think that so many people have heard about glucose, refined carbohydrates. What is worse, fructose or glucose?
Yes. No, I'm not being smart about it because they come together. Like it's really hard to get glucose just by itself. It's really hard to get fructose just by itself. You might be arguing about the percentage requirement, like honey's got more fructose than glucose, and sugar's 50-50, and some of the carbohydrates are going to be higher in glucose. Some of the cereals are going to be higher in glucose and lower in fructose. But they come together. And as I said, via the polyol pathway, in today's society, whilst we're overweight, obese, insulin resistant, pre-diabetic or diabetic for 85% of the population, 30% of the glucose gets converted to fructose. And it's that combination of the inflammatory, the effect of storing glucose. As I say, the body, we're told glucose is critical for our health. And the only cells in the body that require it are our red blood cells, the erythrocytes, some cells in our lens, and some what's called thin cells in the loop of Henle in the kidney. We're talking a very tiny number of cells that actually require glucose. What I'm fascinated by is we're told about how beneficial it is, but I actually think the body does everything in its capacity to get it out of the bloodstream as soon as possible. And the same thing with fructose. Don't let it get in the bloodstream. So fructose, virtually everything, very small, metabolized in the intestinal walls, but most of it metabolized on the first path through the liver. Don't let fructose hit the bloodstream. That's what the gut does. Don't let glucose rise in the blood or the blood tissue, and that's what the body does, particularly under the effect of insulin, to just get it out. The flip side hormone to insulin is glucagon, which is produced by the pancreas. So if our glucose levels drop low down the blood, glucagon will increase, and it will stimulate our liver to break down fat, possibly a little bit through gluconeogenesis, to raise the glucose just up to what we need for the red cells, the lens, and the kidney cells. But it never pushes it up there. So we've got this wonderful mechanism just to raise our glucose to that point. We've got insulin, to drive it down all the time. So are they, you can't really have them purely by themselves. B, I think they both pathways interrelate via the glucose-fructose polyol pathway. They both have their own unique negative effects on the system. Their positive effects are that if you eat them in season, they're there to turn into fat for winter hibernation. And if we eat them in season for those small amounts, they come with their own antidotes. One of the other antidotes, fructose will get converted into small, dense lipoproteins, which are proteins and turn fat and move it around the body. Those lipoproteins can get into the blood vessel walls, create inflammation called foam cells, some of that. The antidote for that is actually vitamin D. So again, if you're going to eat fruit in season, it's in season at the end of summer, beginning of autumn, when there's plenty of sunlight, our vitamin D levels are up. So what I'm saying, if you're going to eat glucose or fructose in season, then they come with their own antidotes. The vitamin C, you're eating it in season, vitamin. So arguably, if you're going to eat carbohydrate, you should eat it in the middle of the day and be naked, and sort of, because it comes with its own antidote. However, our problem in society isn't eating it seasonally, it's eating it 365 days a year and eating the amounts that we're doing, the percentage of our diet, when it's clearly not required, and it comes with the long-term health consequences. And it's just a slow torture on every tissue in the body. And the antidote, the reverse of that is reducing your sugar, reducing your carbohydrate, has no biochemical complication. Reducing the kicker, which is the industrial seed oils, it's just all of a sudden you just drive inflammation out of your body. And those people who decide to go low carb, they start feeling the effects within days. They feel the effects within days. And you're on that journey. We're all on that journey. And reducing ultra-processed foods, in particular the sugar and carbs first up, gives you immediate benefits. People lose weight dramatically. A lot of that's related to the amount of insulin, that you're actually needing less insulin. You lose a lot. You don't need to retain as much water, so you actually pee it out. So people who go low-carb, keto, hardcore early, I'm not saying you need to do that. They'll often lose quite a few kilos those first few weeks, and a lot of that's water or retained fluid in the body. But then the benefits of actually moving on are dramatic. So glucose and fructose, now I think they're... I used to be a rabid anti-smoker, like a campaigner. So I was one of the very first surgeons in Australia to not operate on smokers. I've held polarised opinions. People said, you can't hold that. And I said, well, actually, no, here's the science. I used to give a talk called Where There's Smoke, There's Fire. So literally, there's enough information there talking about tobacco being bad for our health. And I'm talking 35 years ago, I held that stand. It's now commonplace for people to have surgery refused if they're smoking. We're now at the same process, I think, with ultra-processed food, particularly sugar, refined carbohydrate, industrial seed oils. That combination is giving us significant health problems. And it's just a realization, and there's more and more science coming out. When I started talking about this 15 years ago, I was from another planet. But, you've had some fabulous speakers on there filling in. I introduced quite a few of the guys that and ladies, and we've spoken together at conferences. And I'll say, look, I'm very fortunate. I have seen the big picture of the jigsaw, putting the pieces together. And other people are coming in and they're doing the sky and the sea and that twirly bit over there. So it's easier for other people to see the big picture. And, to the point now, I'm very comfortable with saying that if you have someone with type 2 diabetes, which is a problem of not being able to manage the carbohydrate load. If you're a doctor and you are not advising that person to have therapeutic carbohydrate reduction, which is low carb, reducing their sugar and carbs, and you're a doctor and you are not recommending that, I now think you are negligent. That's a powerful word. I'm not alone in that statement. Tim Noakes in South Africa is saying the same thing. Therapeutic carbohydrate reduction should be the first line of management for people with type 2 diabetes and the first line of management for people with pre-diabetes. Oops, we've just talked about 80 to 85% of the world's population, of the Western world's population. So we've got all this circular stuff happening about therapeutic, food guidelines, and there's another review in the US at the moment. There's none happening in Australia at the moment. Are you aware that, or most people are unaware, I know you will be aware, that food guidelines for society are for healthy people? The therapeutic guidelines, the food guidelines for Australia, US, Canada are for healthy people. Latest figures out of the US, 93.2% of the population are metabolically unwell. So the food guidelines are only for 6.8% of the population. Whereas therapeutic carbohydrate reduction is actually there for people with diabetes and pre-diabetes, which is 80% of the population. So rather than fight the Food Guideline Committee, my energy is, why don't we introduce therapeutic carbohydrate reduction to 85% of the population, which will make them metabolically healthier? So let's have condition-specific guidelines. You asked about dementia. We've talked about irritable bowel syndrome. I know you had Georgia Eid on recently talking about mental health and all of those issues. Why don't we actually have condition-specific guidelines for health? And guess what? It's the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's mental health. It doesn't matter if it's diabetes or pre-diabetes or dementia or osteoarthritis or kidney disease. They will all benefit from a lowering of the insulin resistant state and lowering of carbohydrates, ultra-processed food, sugar. So let's get around all of the governments. Sorry, governments, get out of the way, because you're all conflicted by vested interests, and do this. And the beautiful thing is about what you're doing, what I'm doing, what others in this space are doing, is we're actually taking it to the people. And the people are doing their own self-experimentation, which is just fabulous, because by people doing the exact opposite of eating ultra-processed foods, so they reduce their sugar, they reduce their refined carbohydrate, they're reducing their ultra-processed food, their seed oils. Guess what? They're getting healthier. And they're getting healthier within days to weeks. Reversing diabetes within a week. You can't make this up. A small segue, however, is that how long does it take to get the seed oils out of the body? So with the linoleic acid, which is one of the omega-6 ones, and I think one of the pro-inflammatory ones, do you know the half-life of that?
3 to 6 years.
Yeah, roughly about 4 years. And it took a long time, and it's still not entirely certain. So the half-life means that you have a certain amount. To get rid of half of it takes, let's say, 4 years. To get rid of the next half is going to take another 4 years. And the next half of that is another 4 years. They hang around for a long, long, long time. And so linoleic acid, the omega-6, has been measured in our tissues, and it's been estimated to be about 1% 100 to 200 years ago. And in the 1950s, they started measuring it, and we've been able to track it. So currently, the amount of linoleic acid, the omega-6 component of the fat in our bodies, is now up around 25 to 30%. So we've increased the amount of linoleic acid. Or what I say, we're building our cells, our mitochondrial membranes, out of twigs rather than bricks and mortar. And the half-life of that is 4 years. The interesting thing about that is that another anecdotal story came my way yesterday, 2 days ago, that they said they got better. They finally improved after 4 years. He reached improved dramatically for the early few months. But he kept improving for 4 years. And his wife kept improving for 4 years. My sister-in-law, and I'm allowed to tell the story, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and it wasn't quite right, but nonetheless, she went low-carb, keto, carnivore. And Bron now has, after 4 years, she went, oh, everything's gone. It's just interesting, the 4-year time frame. Our youngest daughter, who's just had a birthday, she's 29, when she was about 15, 16, we're at the airport. And this is about informed consent. And she said, Dad, can I have some chips? She wanted the salt and the chips and everything. And she said, I know you hate me eating carbohydrates and seed oils, but I promise, Dad, to not get pregnant for the next 4 years. So any father who has got a tall, beautiful, blonde, long-haired, leggy daughter, I'm not being sexist, I'm saying any father who has been told by his 16-year-old daughter that she's not going to get pregnant for the next 4 years will happily pay a few dollars because she's made an informed decision. So, I mean, this is something smokers have made an informed decision with all the information that's out there to be an idiot and smoke. Today, I would like to think that if you decide to eat ultra-processed food and you want to eat as much of it and regularly, you're making an informed decision to be an idiot about your long-term health. There's now, and we're winning, because I can tell you 15 years ago when I started talking about sugar, again, I said I was from another planet, but now you can ask most people, most mothers raising children, oh, what do you think about having too much sugar? Oh, no, too much sugar is no good for me or no good for the children. So we've raised that bar. There's an understanding in a lot of people to say margarine, the seed oils, the cooking oils are maybe not that healthy. For years, I've asked my patients, I say, do you have butter or margarine? 90% of them are going butter because the margarine, they're saying to me, oh, margarine's no good for me. So it does, and so the shelf, so we're winning a little bit. But I want us to get to, I'd love to see, because we've got therapeutic carbohydrate reduction now as part of national bodies and guidelines, and we've worked really hard for that. What I'd like to see as the next step is if you decide to go to the supermarket, all the processed food is behind locked doors. Like cigarettes are behind locked panels, with health warnings across them. How about we just have all the processed food behind locked doors, that you've got to be over the age of 18, you've got to sign a consent form that you're an idiot, and can I have access to that? And we should be paying 3 or 4 times the price for it, and that, and drive our food subsidies. I know I'm ranting here, but wouldn't that be a wonderful world? And as a result, we might be healthier.
I think that we would be healthier. I think that we have to, even from our own sake, give it that kind of classification where it is poison, it is toxic. You did mention the third class of inflammation, which was the polyunsaturated oils, so the seed oils. So do you want to give a list of what they are? If people are looking at it like, does this have any seed oil in it? What are some names of seed oils?
Well, the classics will be just vegetable oil, which actually means companies can put whatever they want into that. Is that no oils come from vegetables, so that's just a cleansing of making it sound as though it's from something healthy. So anything that says vegetable oil is a polyunsaturated oil. Canola oil, sunflower oil, the safflower oil, they're all vegetable industrial seed oils, because you can't get them without actually grinding them, processing. Look up on YouTube manufacture of margarine, and you'll just see that it comes out of black slimy paste, which is then coloured and bleached, and it's just it's literally straight on poison, because all of that stuff was originally being used for heating candles and lubrication of engines. And Crisco came along as part of a war effort to try and actually decrease the reduction on butter and started manufacturing that. They were also losing a market for candles and because of the electrification, and so therefore it became Crisco cooking oil. To be fair, there are three sorts of oils and fats. So the definition of an oil is it's liquid at room temperature. A fat is solid at room temperature. And they are made up of three things. You've got saturated fats and oil, or saturated fat. You've got monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Monounsaturated means there's one double bond in it. Poly means there's lots of double bonds. Now, they're all actually very similar, but a fat is solid at room temperature because it has no flexibility. There are no double bonds, to actually bend. So those double bonds create flexibility. Plants need double bonds in them so that at cold temperatures, oils, transport mechanisms up and down a leaf or a plant or a stem can occur at cool temperatures. So that flexibility comes from double bonds. Those double bonds are within the oil, and they are required in nature as part of a transport mechanism. We are at 37 degrees Celsius. We're body temperature is enough to make everything nice and flexible. Whereas if we're frozen at zero, our bodies become totally rigid. Now, so in life and in nature, we need flexibility and we need double bonds. We need polyunsaturated oils in our body. As humans, at 37 degrees, we don't need much. We only need a tiny, small amount, and they are essential polyunsaturated oils. We need some linoleic acid. We need a tiny amount. We need 1%. We don't need 30%. The important thing about each of those double bonds is that they can become oxidized. Those double bonds are both points of flexibility, but they're also points of weakness. Oxidation, the simplest thing to understand oxidation is a bit of steel that's outside in the weather, combines with the oxygen, that becomes rust. Again, another spot of inflammation. So if seed oils, if the polyunsaturated oil in the body becomes oxidized, then it becomes a point of inflammation. So when our bodies are 1% polyunsaturated oils, the linoleic acid, then 1% of those tissues are being oxidized, but our bodies cope with that. It's just the insane amount of polyunsaturated oils that are in our body now at 30%. And so it's a perfect storm. And again, I might refer people to any of my talks on inflammation. And again, this is a model, a hypothesis. Can never be proven. You'll never be able to do a double-blind controlled study over 100 years in today's society with one twin having a diet which is entirely carnivore and another twin having completely ultra-processed food. That experiment will never exist. So it's a hypothesis. But my hypothesis, which is my crime, that I came up with this: sugar, the fructose, refined carbohydrate, and the seed oils in combination creates a perfect model of inflammation. And that inflammation occurs in every blood vessel wall, every cell membrane, every mitochondrial membrane. Our mitochondria are the engines of the body. And those mitochondria, which run all of our mechanisms, will run on fat, ketones, protein, and will run on carbohydrate. The only pathway that's not definitely required at mitochondrial level are the carbohydrates. And the cleaner fuel for our body are ketones, which stem from our fat ingestion, our fat production, our fat breakdown. So that's the model, and that's where the seed oils come into it. But the seed oils only end up in our body because of what we eat. So those inflammatory materials, if you eat carbohydrate, ends up in our body and is inflammatory. Fructose has its own biochemical pathways driving behavior and is inflammatory. Glucose, just by itself, is inflammatory and has its own biochemical pathways. of which they end up in every. And so we've had that for centuries, seasonal eating. For the last 100 years, we've been eating higher amounts of fructose and glucose, getting into every portion of the body. It's when the industrial seed oils, the vegetable oils, all those polyunsaturated oils then came in and became the oxidation pathway. That created another layer of inflammation above and beyond what nature could control.
I think you give a very clear picture in terms of those three causes of inflammation. I think some people talk about oxidative stress, inflammation, insulin resistance, but you make it very clear in terms of fructose, fruit, and all the other things that we mentioned, glucose, which is bread, pastas, rice, cereals, all those different things, and then the polyunsaturated oils, so the seed oils, so that if you remove those three categories, you're going to be in good health. Another question that people ask is, well, what do I eat? Everything seems bad. They're told everything is bad. Can you give some outline as to what is a good foundation for people to eat for optimal health?
Okay, I'll summarize it in one sentence, because I'm a surgeon, so therefore, being a surgeon, you're allowed to be arrogant. So I've rewritten the dietary guidelines for, I used to think just for all humans, but I'll actually say I've rewritten the dietary guidelines for all living creatures. And it's this: eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your environment and culture, avoiding added sugar and processed food. And you can take that apart, every single bit of that statement. I've described low-carb keto carnivore, but I've put it in literally palatable terms. You need to have a diet which is complete in essential proteins. You need to have a diet which is complete in essential fats. You need to have a diet which is complete in micronutrients and vitamins and minerals. There is not a single biochemical pathway which requires ingested carbohydrate. I say it over and over again. Debate it with me, tell me, but we do not need a carbohydrate in our diet. And too many of them is toxic. The only way to have that complete profile is to have a diet with a significant animal-based product in it. Plant-based product across the board does not have a complete nutritional profile of proteins, fats, micronutrients, and it comes with a whole lot of allergens and things which are irritating, phytates, the pectins, the lectins, all of that. And Anthony Chaffee's spoken about that as well. And they come so the plant-based product, and it comes with fructose and it comes with glucose, comes with a lot more pesticides, and without traveling all those pathways. But the plant-based diet is going to be nutritionally incomplete and will require supplementation and likely medication. So if you're having animal-based product in your diet and you're eating nose to tail, then you're going to be fine. So, people say, what do I eat? Well, I'm not 100% carnivore. I am when I'm batching. When Belinda's away, I'll eat predominantly meat, eggs, cheese, cream. Meat, eggs, cheese, cream. That's about it, right? But we've got our own free-range chickens. I've got sheep. Now, we've married into a farming family, so we get a good supply of lamb. You do need to eat some, to get all of the micronutrients. You probably need to have something like some liver in there. So you can have pate. I've got a Germanic background, so we've got a local supplier who makes some liverwurst. You don't have to go along and cook your organ meats, even though I've actually got some minced liver, minced heart downstairs, which I'll actually put into minced meat. Buy the cheap minced meat because it's got more fat in it, and you put that in there, and that's a good way of hiding liver, because most people think, well, I don't want to eat liver, but so having a bit of liver, you can put it in, and I call that a keto mince or a super mince, because it's got fat in it, it's got protein in it, and it's got a whole lot of micronutrients. And you just put 5% liver into that, and you mix it up and hide it with the spices. We do have some vegetables from time to time, but that's culturally part of life. And it does add a bit of variety. But do I need them? No. But, again, if 90% of people did 90% of what we're talking about, they're going to be 90% healthier. And I don't think people should cut themselves up and go, oh, I've just had some sugar. Oh, just understand that if you have lapsed, that don't cut yourself up and have an enormous guilt trip about it. Not everyone who gives up cigarettes does it in one day. Not everybody who eats any processed food. Because, as I said, we're in this society, we're surrounded by advertising, we're surrounded by food misinformation, disinformation, which is driven down from the corporates by religious ideology, people writing vested interests. We are completely distracted. You'll be, I've been censored. Some of your algorithms change because of YouTube and whatever's happening on. I can't talk about meat and can't talk about this and that and that. And work out where the whole plant activism society is coming from, and its corporate influence, its ideological influences, which we haven't really spent much on today. But when you actually look at all that, that's where it's really hard to go to the shops and not be distracted by all the stuff that's happening there. It's really hard to pick up a newspaper or listen to the radio. Just the other day we heard someone on our ABC, the national broadcaster here, talking about the benefits of Ozempic, as a weight loss drug. He, however, failed to declare his conflict of interest that he was being paid for by Ozempic, by Novo Nordisk, to actually talk about. So he's introduced as this professor of blah, 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 street credibility, but at the same time, it should have been introduced as he's the professor of blah, 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 and he's being paid X number of dollars by Ozempic to promote this drug, and we're going to have a chat to him. That didn't happen. And the same thing happens when you go to the cereal box section of the supermarket, which I just walk past now. I just go in there as a matter of interest. But, all these beautiful colours, natural colours. Oh, this is a natural product. It's got a grey cardboard box on there with beautiful fruit and pictures on it. It's just advertising. And think all of that colourful pictures on the fruit, on the food labelling, is there to distract us. Just like the colourful fruit in nature, it's there to distract us, to make us eat it. And it's not just for our benefit, it's for the fruit's benefit. It's for the food manufacturer's benefit. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If it's ready to eat, it's probably not ready to digest. It's just eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food. It's literally, that's my mantra. And if you want to do something opposite to that, good luck to you, but make an informed decision to be an idiot.
Well, I think that a lot of people would find that very clear. Low carb, keto, carnivore lifestyles is the way you kind of choose one that is right for you. Dr. Fettke, thank you so much. That has been a long journey of where you came from, being silenced, to the other side of being open and being able to speak the truth about what's happening in the world. We didn't talk much about who's paying off who and all those different things, but I'm sure that we can do that in another different conversation. If people want to find you and learn from you more, where can they find you?
I think watching any of my talks or my wife's talk, Belinda Fettke, on YouTube gives more information. As I said, I got into trouble with the medical board for making it too simple for people to understand, but I use lots of pictures and diagrams so that people can actually see what I'm talking about and follow that through. So our talks are largely on YouTube. I'm on Twitter. I suppose I'm a bit naughty there, just throw out a bit of stuff from time to time. I'm not trying to appease anyone or make anyone happy. So most of the stuff we're doing is actually talking to you. And if we can get our information out beyond what I call the bubble, and so quite a few talks I do to the crypto guys. I find them, that crypto community, quite an interesting community because they're naysayers and they're looking to other options outside of the traditional pathways. So you'll find us popping up on podcasts here, there, and everywhere. So anybody who wants to listen to our message, you'll find us somewhere or other. Just Google Gary Fettke, Belinda Fettke. But I think we're just trying to make a difference. Just as Belinda's always said, we're just a couple of tiny little mosquitoes that can be swatted away. But if you are trying to go to sleep at night, it's really hard to go to sleep with a mosquito in the room. So that's all we are.
You're not tiny and you're not a mosquito. You are amazing and you both do amazing work. I want to say a big thank you for everything that you do, all the message that you provide to people that are being confused. But I hope that from this episode, they're less confused and more clear about what to eat and how to have optimal health. Dr. Fettke, thank you so much. And I'm sure we're going to see you very soon.
Ren, thank you for your time.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode with Dr. Gary Fettke. You can find the full show notes, including books, resources, and journal articles at the Primal Labs. There is a link in the description of this episode. If you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast. If you have a question for me or a recommendation of a guest speaker, please leave that in the YouTube comments, as I check every single one. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm on Instagram and also on X, formerly known as Twitter, under the name of The Primal Podcast, as I generally share different information to what you'll see here on YouTube. I share different health tips and advice that I hear from the best doctors and experts. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode, you'll also enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Jason Fung. Dr. Fung will talk about the number one way to lose weight and also prevent chronic disease and why it comes down to your hormones, specifically insulin. He'll also talk about why counting calories is not the answer and why that will fail most of the time. Dr. Fung will also explain the easy steps to start intermittent fasting and also the role of extended fasting to lose weight and prevent chronic disease. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.